The sea is black glass until it isn't. Diesel throbs through steel, a slow heartbeat under thousands of boots. Salt stings lips, kerosene rides the wind, and every hatch leaks a wedge of red light. On the horizon, Africa, a dark line where the Atlantic ends and a war begins. The order is simple and impossible. Land an army before dawn across 3 countries with sailors who have never seen this coast and soldiers who have never fired a shot in anger. The paradox snaps like a cable, more than 500 miles of shoreline, and the plan says it all happens in one night. What turns new recruits into an invasion force? Engines cough and settle into rhythm. Landing craft creak as if the wood remembers storms from other oceans. A petty officer whispers numbers over and over, waves, bearings, time to the beach, because numbers feel like control. Somewhere forward, a chaplain prays in a voice drowned by the churn. The smell shifts from oil to algae as the flotilla shoals. The sea is shallow, the fear is not. The first test of a nation's war is measured in inches of water and yards of sand. U.S. Navy after action, 1943. The date is certain, 8th of November, 1942. The places are 3, Morocco, Algeria, and the span of water between them. The figures anchor the risk. Nearly 107,000 Allied troops are assigned to the assault echelons, the majority American. More than 300 warships and escorts, more than 350 transports and landing vessels, and a supply train designed to feed an army for 30 days on a hostile coast. The geography is the enemy's ally. Surf, reefs, harbors that can be mined by a stubborn defender, and cities that can turn into traps if politics sour by dawn. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The plan divides the ocean. West, Casablanca, Fidala beaches. Patton's armor, green but eager. Center, Oran, 2 harbors, boom nets, coastal guns waiting in their concrete arcs. East, Algiers, politics as much as gunfire. A race to seize airfields before daylight. Spread across 5 time zones of command and 2 languages of coalition, the operation threads a needle in the dark. The Axis motif is clear already. North Africa is the classroom and the exam on the same night, where American newcomers either learn fast or bleed slow. In the holds, men grip webbing and feel the deck vibrate under them. It is not fear of dying, it is fear of failing. Their rifles are heavy with preservative grease, their pockets jammed with hard candy and Lucky Charms. They breathe canvas, sweat, and the last warm coffee sloshing in canteen cups. Officers check luminous compasses and blink at the phosphorescence in the wake, the sea writing green equations behind steel hulls. Each equation ends with the same unknown. How will the French fire? U.S. Army Brief, 1942. There is a paradox inside the paradox. The United States is a continent-sized factory that can melt ore into Liberty ships in weeks. But amphibious warfare is choreography, not just production. 30 seconds too early, and a company lands into empty dark with no support. 30 seconds too late, and the first wave dies alone. Doctrine is thin, rehearsal is thinner. American assault troops have practiced on Carolina beaches, not on Atlantic swells under African stars. U.S. Naval War College Note, 1942. Numbers give the outline of courage. Western Naval Task Force, approximately 35,000 troops and 100 ships for Morocco. Center Task Force, about 39,000 with more than 100 vessels off Oran. Eastern Task Force, roughly 33,000 landing near Algiers under the umbrella of British experience. Air cover is a balancing act. Carriers Ranger and 4 escort decks at the western end. RAF and FAA units flying long legs from Gibraltar to the east. The math says enough, but war is a place where math lies until blood corrects it. U.S. Navy after action, 1943. Sound becomes the first enemy. The low boom of surf can smother a platoon's whispers or carry a single clank of davit iron a mile inland. The order to go is a hand on a shoulder, not a shout. Ropes rasp, boats drop, and 1,000 small splashes stitch a moving seam between ship and shore. For men in the bow, the world is 3 things. The dark, the smell of cordite from someone testing a gun aft, and the taste of salt rinsing fear out of a dry mouth. Torch is a bet on speed and psychology as much as firepower. Vichy French garrisons, morale uncertain, loyalty divided, sit in fortified ports built to fight pirates and empires. Some officers despise Germany, others despise being told to stand aside. If the Americans land fast, seize the airfields, and bring in political emissaries before the first full magazine is fired, thousands of lives can be saved. If not, every key can become a killing lane. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Politics rides with the surf. At Algiers, clandestine meetings with dissident officers light the path. In Oran and Casablanca, the path might be lit by tracer. The coalition is delicate. British admirals, American generals, free French agents, and cloak and dagger promises to men who risk the gallows if they choose wrong. The operation must fight and persuade at the same time. The rookie army is about to learn that a landing schedule is a political document printed in gunpowder. The material scale is a character of its own. 16 troop convoys cross the Atlantic in staggered streams. The westernmost sails straight from the United States without staging in the British Isles, an audacity of logistics. Each convoy is a moving city of fuel, ammunition, bulldozers, rations, field hospitals, and spare propellers. One figure tells the intent. More than 500,000 rations in the first wave stocks, calculated at 3,600 calories per man per day, to power wet boots through dry sand. U.S. Quartermaster Summary, 1943. Light becomes the second enemy. A sliver of moon can silhouette a coxswain at the wrong moment, and a searchlight can turn a cove into an arena. The order, "no smoking topside," travels with the same urgency as "fix bayonets." Captains grope for landmarks that are rumors in the dark. A white house above Fedala. A jetty at Oran like a knuckle into the sea. One British navigator murmurs, "Africa is where the map ends and the shoreline begins." The helmsman nods without humor. BBC interview, 1962. The Axis motif returns. This is the first American amphibious strike of the war. The moment where a nation of factories must become a nation of landings. The yardsticks are brutal. How many boats launched per minute? How many radios survive the first spray? How many engineers get off the sand and cut wire before the second wave tangles in it? The difference between rehearsal and reality is measured in bodies. The western beaches wear different names on different tongues. Fedala, Mehdia, Safi. But they share one geometry. A shallow approach, a bar of breaking surf, and a coastline that can pivot from quiet to fury if a battery commander decides to test his optics. At Mehdia, a Kasbah commands the Cebu mouth with masonry that has watched centuries. At Fedala, hotels peer down at sand like curious aristocrats. War insists that every scenic view is a potential field of fire. U.S. Navy after action, 1943. Casablanca is not just a port. It is a fortress that includes the massive half-completed battleship in harbor, guns ashore, and the pride of a garrison uncertain about orders, but certain about honor. The Americans bring armor meant to leave tracks on boulevards by nightfall. The French bring a decision that could swing an empire's colonial spine, resist and bleed, or bargain and shift. Somewhere at sea, a carrier pilot runs his thumb along a map crease and wonders if flak tastes different in North Africa. Oran's approaches split the difference between audacity and caution. There are two harbors, Mers el-Kebir to the west and Oran proper to the east, both with booms and guns, both with the memory of 1940 when a British squadron turned French battleships into twisted puzzles of iron to keep them from German hands. The air itself feels charged by history. A plan floats, a coup de main with destroyers dashing straight into piers, disgorging assault teams under searchlights and shouting. It reads like cinema. It will play like attrition. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Algiers is a stage for intrigue. Allied agents talk in rooms where shutters never quite close. Lists of names change hands. Officers who might open gates. Policemen who might look the other way. cadets who might cut phone lines at 3 a.m. The landing schedule pencils in political miracles between tides. The lesson is adult, not romantic. Diplomacy can shorten firefights by hours. It can also fail in seconds when a corporal misreads a silhouette. U.S. State Defense Cable, 1942. Smell is the third enemy and the oldest friend. The coast breathes tar, fish, and rotting weed. For some men, it smells like distant childhood summers. For others, it smells like the last thing they will ever know. Boots slide on slime-coated stones where maps promised clean sand. An ensign tastes blood from a split lip and laughs without humor. It seems appropriate that the sea takes tribute. The arithmetic of landing is savage. A Higgins boat carries 36 men or a jeep and a squad. At 3 knots under load, it needs 30 to 40 minutes from ship to shore in this swell. Multiply by hundreds, stagger by currents, subtract for boats stove in by surf, divide by patches of sand that turn into killing zones if a single machine gun finds its range. The spreadsheet under the operation order bends into a prayer. U.S. Navy Amphibious Planning, 1942. In a troop hold, a private traces his finger along the seam of his helmet and whispers the only quote he will ever remember saying, "If I get off the ramp, I can go forward. If I don't, I can't." It is not courage, it is clarity. The men around him grin because clarity is contagious. Above them, a bosun's pipe shrieks pure metal, and the rope ladder thumps the hull like a dictation of fate. The coalition breathes together for the first time under fire. British signal lamps wink toward American bridges. American coxswains curse in slang that sounds exotic to Royal Navy ears. The RAF speaks in altitudes. The USAAF answers in gallons per minute. The Free French speak in conditionals. The common language is timing. If the airfields fall before sunrise, the second wave lands into a safer world. If they do not, carriers must fly until their decks are empty and their pilots begin to talk to themselves on downwind. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Light finally comes like a verdict. Africa shows its bones. Scrub, dunes, a few palm clumps, a line of whitewash along the first buildings. With light comes accuracy for both sides. Coastal batteries that kept silence out of doubt now thunder out of reflex. Allied guns answer with habit and haste. A destroyer's 5-inch sows white slashes along a fort wall. Someone cheers too soon. The new army learns a rule as old as Veii. Stone can hate you back. The Axis motif threads again. North Africa is the forge where Americans learn the alloy of coalition war. Steel from industry, carbon from courage, and temper from failure corrected in real time. On paper, the United States is already a military power. On these beaches, it is not yet obvious. The distance between those statements is the work of a day measured in lifetimes. The enemy is not simply a man with a rifle. It is a harbor master who refuses to cut booms. It is a colonel who hesitates over a coded order. It is a mine planted by a bored sailor the week before and forgotten until a hull peels open like fruit. It is a rain squall that turns powder to paste in a loader's hands. It is a radio valve that fails and turns a battalion into a rumor. War has more ways to say no than a staff officer has synonyms for proceed. U.S. Navy After Action, 1943. Patton stands on a destroyer's bridge in the Western Group, binoculars pressed so hard they leave a crescent on his brow. He wants speed, shock, and the theater of inevitability. The men he commands want footing and a horizon that stops moving. The city he wants, Casablanca, wants to wake up any other day. A staff officer mutters tonnage and tides under his breath like a catechism. A signalman wipes salt from a lamp lens and thinks about breakfast. War shrinks empires to small chores. The scale of supply grinds behind every heroic verb. Fuel, more than 3 million gallons in the initial assault echelons, in cans and in tanks, some of which will never touch African soil because rough seas will claim them. Ammunition, tens of millions of rounds in calibers that must match guns that must survive the surf to fire them. Medical stores, plasma, morphine, sulfa packets, stretchers in stacks like flat coffins. Bulldozers with names painted on their blades because engineers know they are going to be famous or dead by nightfall. U.S. Quartermaster Summary, 1943. Sight is the fourth enemy. Heat haze fakes distance even at dawn. A palm grove looks like a battalion from 3 miles out. A hotel balcony looks like a pillbox from 2. A captain chooses between waiting for certainty or firing blind and making certainty with noise. He fires. The rounds bracket a white building that erupts in crockery and dust. A French family drags mattresses into a hallway and curses 2 flags in 2 languages. The first splashes on the first beaches are not heroic. They are clumsy, cold, and heavy with packs that drink seawater like thirsty animals. A private loses his helmet to a wave and finds it pinned to the sand by the weight of his own fear. A sergeant yanks him up and laughs because the only other thing to do is scream. They stumble through a shore break that feels like a wall built by the Atlantic itself. The wall falls for no one. Men climb over each other and discover that sometimes a path is a body. Radio discipline phrase where it must. This is Red 2, off course 300 yards, heavy surf, heavy opposition, becomes help. Beach green requires engineers, wire uncut, becomes now. A naval gunfire liaison officer flips his fire plan to the back and begins to write coordinates in the margins with a pencil that breaks every time the ship rolls. He keeps writing with the stub. The stub is enough. U.S. Navy after action, 1943. At Algiers, the political gamble pays first. Gates open that would have been barricades on any other coast. A handful of officers choose a future with the Allies at the cost of a past with their careers. A junior French officer says, "Enough," and it is worth battalions. The lesson slaps. In coalition war, a signature at midnight can be stronger than a machine gun at noon. The rookies on the sand cannot see the ink, but they feel the slackening of the lash. At Oran, bravado runs aground. The destroyer dashes toward the mole or textbooks written in adrenaline. Pike, broke, and the plan that a ship can become a platoon if you ram it far enough into a harbor. Searchlights find them. Coastal guns wake fully, and the night turns to sparks. Ladders slam against slime-slick walls. Men climb into tracer, and the harbor refuses to be surprised a second time in 2 years. The lesson is permanent. Audacity is a currency that only spends once per port. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Casablanca argues with itself. Shore batteries answer with pride. Harbor craft scatter. Field guns decide they are coastal weapons if they can see the sea. Off the beaches, American ships duel both masonry and history. Somewhere inside the breakwater, a French battleship with more reputation than readiness becomes a symbol again, trading salvos with modern doctrine. On the sand, a corporal ties a demolition charge and tells his squad to look away. He smiles because he has discovered that leadership is saying, "Look at me," only when death needs a volunteer. Taste is the fifth enemy and the first comfort. Powder on the tongue, brine in the throat, and then the metallic tang of an opened ration can when someone says, "Eat now, it's worse later." The can tastes like victory because it is fuel that did not drown. A runner gulps coffee cold enough to hurt and grins at the burn. He needs the hurt to be sure he is still here. The Axis motif returns for the third time. North Africa is the hinge on which American war turns from theory to practice. Every mistake is a teacher that demands a down payment in blood. Every success is a receipt for future operations spelled Sicily, Salerno, Normandy. The class is pass-fail. The grade is written in names etched later into marble. By mid-morning, numbers change from estimates to counts. Beaches seized. 2 of 3 in the west, 1 with a Casbah still barking. Airfields secured. A precious few, enough to begin the air bridge that makes amphibious war possible beyond the first tide. Casualties, counted in clipboard columns, already heavier than any training imagination allowed. Prisoners, faces that look like cousins, bewildered more than beaten. The ledger of war starts its grim fascination. U.S. Army G1 Summary, 1942. A quote surfaces from a lieutenant with sand in his teeth. "We are learning faster than we are dying." It is gallows optimism and accurate math. The battalion commander nods because any other sentence would be a lie, and men can smell lies at 100 yards. He orders the next push inland, toward a road that looks like a promise on a map and like a dare in reality. The coalition stretches its muscles. British units bring tempo where American units bring mass. American logistics bring confidence where British staff work brings caution disciplined by scars from 1940 to 41. Free French liaison officers translate not just words, but intent. A tank platoon commander discovers that a French road can carry 30 tons if you do not ask permission from the culvert. He drives and the culvert holds because engineering is sometimes faith-wearing steel tracks. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Sun climbs, heat beats down, and the light that betrayed positions at dawn now blinds. Mirage turns distance treacherous. Barrels shimmer. A machine gunner squints and fires 3 rounds at a ghost because the worst enemy of ammunition economy is nerves. A medic crouches behind a dune and inventories his bag by feel. He knows he will need all of it and then imagination after that. By noon, torch ceases to be a plan and becomes a place. Men who learned beach codes in Norfolk now say Algerian place names without irony. A captain who drew arrows on a sand table now draws them in real sand with his boot. Engineers who recited tables of explosives now blow gaps in real wire. And the click of metal teeth becomes the official language of progress. The Americans are not veterans yet, but they have ceased to be tourists. The numbers of distance take on flavor. From Fedala to Casablanca is about 15 miles by map and a lifetime by fire. From the quay at Oran to Tafaraoui airfield is less than a dozen miles, and a dozen miles is the width of a new front. From Algiers harbor to Maison Blanche airfield is a handful of miles that changes how many hours a fighter can stay overhead. War measures in time more than ground, and time is bought with landing craft, radios, and men who do not sit down when a bullet kicks sand in their teeth. U.S. Navy after action, 1943. In the afternoon, the Atlantic reminds admirals who is senior. Swell increases, surf steepens, and boat cycles slip. Schedules written with ruler-straight optimism begin to curve. The green American amphibious machine groans but does not seize. A coxswain grins at a wave that should have killed him and calls it by a name he gave a girl in Brooklyn. The wave declines the compliment and breaks a different boat instead. There is no romance in physics. Politics moves again as the sun tilts. At Algiers, deals turn into orders. At Casablanca, orders still turn into arguments. At Oran, arguments turn back into orders with new signatures. The Americans learn an adult truth. Coalition war is a conversation where everyone is hard of hearing, and the loudest voice is the gun that is closest to the map's edge. The only amplifier that never lies is momentum. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Dusk folds over beaches that look like construction sites. Bulldozers push causeways of crushed barges. Signal flags hang limp as wind dies. Somebody finally remembers to eat something that isn't hope. A company clerk writes the first clean list of the day. Who is here, who is not. And he writes it twice because the paper might become sacred by morning. The sea, satisfied with its rent, lies down and pretends it was always a friend. Night returns like a teacher grading papers. The grades are mixed. Radios that were stubborn at dawn are cooperative by starlight. Batteries that barked without orders at sunrise now wait for permission that will not come. The rookie army has a beachhead. Its maps now have dirt on them. It is enough to begin. It is never enough to finish. The first block ends where the invasion begins, with the smell of wet canvas, the rasp of sand in boots, and the arithmetic of a new competence forming under fire. America's first big test is not passed or failed in one tide, but the curve bends. In the dark, a sergeant tells a joke so bad his squad howls with relief. A private writes the date with a finger on the side of a truck and falls asleep mid-stroke. A major falls silent and listens for the surf because the surf is the metronome of this new music, and he wants to conduct it better tomorrow. The first French shells screamed at dawn. They were not German, not Axis, but they had the sound of defiance. At Casablanca, the shore batteries lit their throats with fire and threw iron into the surf. American destroyers answered, their 5-inch guns cracking the still morning like axes on iron doors. The water turned into a field of geysers, each column of spray lit pale against the first sun. New soldiers huddled lower in their boats, tasting cordite before they ever touched land. The first American test of arms began not against Germans, but against old allies caught in the politics of a broken empire. The paradox was savage. Liberation and invasion shared the same beaches. U.S. Navy after action, 1943. Casablanca was defended by men torn in loyalty. Vichy orders said resist. Pride said do not yield the harbor. Confusion said wait. But the guns did not wait. They barked from the Kasbah at Media and from the hills around Fadala. The Americans had promised a swift landing, but the surf was thick, the currents twisted, and the signal lamps blinked confusion. By 7 a.m., units were landing a mile off their marked beaches, some under fire, some in sand too deep for tanks to roll. The neat arrows of planning melted into improvisation within minutes. U.S. National Archives, 1946. Patton's men ground forward anyway. Bulldozers were late, wire cutters jammed, and beachmasters shouted themselves hoarse. A sergeant with a Tommy gun found that French sandbags did not look different from German sandbags, and the bullets flying above him did not care about politics. He yelled to his squad, "Forward is the only map we have," and they went, because standing still meant drowning. Tanks lurched from landing craft like beasts shocked by daylight. Some drowned in surf, others roared up onto sand with exhaust screaming like cattle brands pressed to flesh. The air war came quickly. Vichy French planes, WWII fighters painted in tricolor, swept low in brave arcs. They clawed at American bombers trying to suppress batteries. The sky filled with the contradiction of friends turned foes. American pilots flying from Ranger and Sewanee gritted teeth as they pulled the trigger on men who wore cockades once allied. War is not a lecture in morality. It is a table of angles and speeds. By midday, wrecks smoked on both land and sea, and the only certainty was that America was no longer a novice. U.S. Navy Air Report, 1942. At Oran, the fight was sharper. The plan for destroyers to dash straight into the mole was audacity incarnate. Broke and Walney pushed at flank speed, flags snapping, decks packed with troops who clutched rifles too tightly. Spotlights stabbed, French gunners woke, and a moment of silence broke into an eruption. Shells slashed steel, oil lit flames, and men tumbled into black water. Of 400 troops aboard, more than half were killed or captured in minutes. The dream of a cinematic coup died at the harbor wall. The survivors called it a baptism of fire not found in any manual. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The landings east and west of Oran fared better. Beaches near Arzew saw Americans pushing ashore against scattered fire. Engineers cut gaps, infantry surged, and tanks clanked down wooden ramps that cracked under weight but held long enough. A corporal wrote later, "The sand was wet with diesel and blood. We did not stop moving." The phrase captured the essence of the invasion. Movement was survival. The town of Arzew fell within hours, giving a foothold to strike inland. But Oran itself bristled, and the defenders fought with stubborn honor. Algiers unfolded differently. Politics worked as well as firepower. Resistance officers inside the city rose at the appointed hour, seizing key junctions, cutting phone lines, and confusing loyalists. When American troops came ashore east and west of the harbor, they met sporadic fire but also open gates. By noon, negotiations rolled as tanks rumbled, and a city that could have cost thousands of lives fell with a strange blend of force and persuasion. An officer recorded dryly, "Ink saved as much blood as bullets today." BBC interview, 1962. The Axis motif sharpened. This was America's first major test: how to fight, persuade, and improvise at the same time. Every mile of coast demanded a different lesson. Casablanca demanded endurance under fire. Oran demanded adaptation when boldness failed. Algiers demanded diplomacy under the gun. Together, they wrote the curriculum of modern coalition war. It was not the tidy plan of staff colleges. It was survival rewritten in sand and smoke. The numbers hardened by the second day. More than 500 killed, over 700 wounded among American forces in the first hours, according to staff returns. French casualties ran higher in some sectors, especially at Oran. Dozens of landing craft wrecked by surf or fire. Supply losses measured in tons. Gasoline drums holed, ammunition crates sunk, medical packs lost before they touched Earth. The mathematics of Torch was already bloody but instructive. Commanders scribbled margins with equations that mixed courage with loss. U.S. Army G1 Report, 1942. Smell became the dominant memory. Burned oil coated the harbors at Oran. Rotting seaweed mingled with cordite along the Fadala beaches. In Algiers, the scent of citrus groves drifted over roads where tanks clattered, a surreal reminder of life beyond war. One soldier wrote, "The oranges smelled stronger than the gun smoke." For men from Iowa or Kansas, it was the first time war and paradise shared a horizon. It taught them that the world was bigger than their fear. U.S. National Archives, 1946. By the second night, Casablanca still fought. The French battleship Jean Bart, incomplete but armed with heavy guns, fired defiantly from harbor. American battleships Massachusetts and cruisers replied, shells crossing above the city like steel constellations. Buildings shuddered, masonry crumbled, and civilians crouched in basements as navies argued over politics with powder. The sheer volume was astonishing. More than 800 shells exchanged in a day, a duel that decided whether a port would yield or burn. U.S. Navy Gunnery Log, 1942. On land, infantry pushed cautiously. Villages near Medea saw firefights in alleys, while Fadala streets echoed with shouts in English, French, and Arabic. Confusion blurred enemy from ally until white armbands and shouted passwords made order. A lieutenant noted, "Every corner was an exam, pass or die." The metaphor was apt. America's first test was not only on sand, but in the human maze of occupied towns. Oran finally cracked on the third day. Airfields fell, defenders surrendered, and the harbor ceased spitting defiance. More than 2,000 prisoners marched out under guard, their boots echoing in streets still smoking from bombardment. American soldiers watched with surprise. They had expected Germans, not Frenchmen in familiar uniforms. The realization sank in. This war would twist loyalties and present battles without villains or heroes, only necessity. Red Cross Report, 1945. At Algiers, the surrender came even sooner. The city was secure within 48 hours. American troops bivouacked in olive groves, staring at minarets outlined against sunset. For many, it was their first glimpse of Africa beyond a beachhead. A sergeant wrote, "It was beautiful, but we still kept our rifles loaded." The contradiction captured the moment. Wonder and danger bound together. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The ethical capsule rose naturally. The Geneva Conventions recognized prisoners, but what of an enemy who was once an ally? The French were treated correctly, given food and medical care, but the bitterness was sharp. Some Americans called them traitors. Others pitied them as pawns. Historians later debated, was Torch an invasion of a neutral or a liberation from collaboration? The line blurred, and the debate remains. This is where law met politics, and men carried the weight of both. The lesson for America was brutal clarity. Amphibious war demanded more than courage. It demanded synchronization across oceans. It demanded improvisation when surf shredded timetables. It demanded diplomacy at gunpoint. It demanded a willingness to fight men who yesterday were not enemies. Above all, it demanded endurance, the capacity to absorb loss and still move forward. Torch delivered all those lessons in the first 3 days. The rookies were becoming soldiers. Numbers carried the message home. Within 72 hours, More than 107,000 Allied troops stood on North African soil. Casualties were real but not crippling. Ports that had fired in defiance now hosted unloading cranes. Airfields that could have raked beaches now sheltered Allied fighters. The gamble had paid at cost, but with momentum. The United States had passed the first section of its exam. The grade was not perfect. It was enough to continue. U.S. Army Logistics Summary, 1942. At Casablanca, the final surrender came after fierce exchanges. Jean Bart lay battered, the port scarred, but the city was intact enough to serve. Oran was subdued. Algiers was in Allied hands. In less than a week, North Africa had changed banners. The seas that had been Axis hunting grounds now carried convoys with less fear. The deserts ahead still promised hardship, but the beaches behind whispered proof. America could land, fight, and hold. That whisper grew into confidence across the Atlantic. The Axis motif echoed again. America's first big test was not only about victory, it was about identity. Were they still a nation of amateurs, or had they begun to walk as professionals among allies? The answer lay in the sand of Fidala, the piers of Oran, and the boulevards of Algiers. It was written in casualty lists, in captured airfields, and in the silence of guns that no longer fired. The test was not finished, but it had been survived, and survival in war is the seed of victory. The landings had secured the beaches, the ports, and the airfields, but the real contest still waited further east. German high command had been surprised but not paralyzed. Within hours of the first reports, cables flew from Berlin to Rome, from Rome to Tunis. Hitler ordered reinforcements into North Africa, determined that Tunisia would become a fortress and a trap. Mussolini promised divisions and planes. For the Axis, Operation Torch was not a defeat. It was a signal to accelerate. For the Americans, it meant the honeymoon of landing was over. The real test would be against the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe, veterans hardened by years of war. Convoys began to move across the narrow waist of the Mediterranean. Within days, German transports landed in Bizerte and Tunis. Paratroopers leapt from the skies, engineers dug positions, and artillery rolled into olive groves. By the end of November, more than 15,000 Axis troops were entrenched in Tunisia, supported by over 100 tanks and dozens of aircraft. The battlefield had shifted from French indecision to German precision. The Americans had to adapt. U.S. Army G2 Report, 1942. The march east exposed the inexperience of the U.S. Army. Roads in North Africa were narrow, rutted, and often non-existent. Rain turned tracks into rivers, while sun hardened the soil into stone. Trucks broke axles, jeeps clogged in convoys, and supply dumps sprawled across fields without protection. Soldiers walked with dust in their throats by day, and mud caked on boots by night. A private wrote home, "The earth itself seems to resist us. Every mile is a fight." The comment captured the dual struggle, against the enemy and against the environment. Logistics became the new front line. Every bullet, every shell, every loaf of bread had to travel from ports like Oran and Algiers across hundreds of kilometers of uncertain road. Fuel was rationed, drivers slept in cabs, and mechanics worked until their hands bled. Numbers reveal the scale. In December alone, more than 200,000 tons of supplies were unloaded, but barely two-thirds reached the front in time. The mathematics of torch became crueler with distance. U.S. Army Quartermaster Records, 1943. The light of North Africa shocked newcomers. The sun was merciless, blinding at noon, turning metal into fire and helmets into furnaces. Soldiers squinted until eyes watered, rifles burned palms, and sweat traced mud down cheeks. At dusk, the light changed. Long shadows stretched across wadis, and silhouettes of olive trees resembled men waiting with rifles. Veterans of France or Britain muttered that Africa itself was an enemy. Americans, new to such brilliance, learned quickly to fight under a sky that exposed every mistake. The Germans tested them immediately. On November 28th, the first clashes erupted near Jadida, only a few kilometers from Tunis. American units pushed forward too quickly, hoping to seize the city before reinforcements arrived. Instead, they met German armor, Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns. The Shermans rattled into battle, but in the narrow lanes and muddy fields, coordination broke. A platoon leader reported, "Their tanks fired before we even saw them. The sun was behind them, and we walked into the glare." The result was predictable. Several American tanks burned, crews scrambled out with faces blackened, and infantry fell back in disorder. U.S. National Archives, 1946. The Luftwaffe added to the shock. Stukas dove on convoys, sirens screaming across open plains. Ju-88 bombers rained explosives on depots, igniting gasoline that rolled fire across ground for hundreds of meters. American soldiers, unused to constant air threat, dove into ditches and pressed into soil that felt hot even without bombs. Anti-aircraft gunners learned quickly, but the losses mounted. By December, more than 80 trucks a week were destroyed by air attack. The rookies were learning with blood. German commanders were unimpressed by the Americans at first. One diary entry from a panzer officer recorded, "They advance boldly but without skill. Their equipment is plentiful, but their use of it is clumsy. We can handle them." Wehrmacht Diary, 1942. That arrogance would later prove costly. But in Tunisia, the Germans had the advantage of time, terrain, and training. The Americans had numbers, but numbers stumble without experience. The French role blurred again. Some units that had surrendered days earlier now rejoined the Allies, bringing knowledge of roads, maps, and villages. Others hesitated, still caught in the politics of loyalty. The result was a patchwork army. Americans, British, and French learning to cooperate while Germans exploited every gap. Torch became not just a battle, but a rehearsal for coalition war. Success depended on whether officers could align strategy with languages and rivalries. The sensory memory of these weeks was tactile. Soldiers remembered the grip of dry earth under fingers as they dug foxholes. They recalled the sting of cactus spines on uniforms, the feel of boots cracking after endless marches, and the rough wood of crates carried mile after mile. War was no longer only sound and sight. It was texture pressed into skin. The Americans learned that the battlefield could be felt as much as seen. Numbers of loss accumulated. By early December, more than 1,200 American casualties had been recorded in Tunisia. Dozens of tanks destroyed, hundreds of trucks lost, and thousands of tons of supplies captured or burned. German forces were fewer in number, barely 30,000 at the start. But their concentration near Tunis magnified their effect. They moved fast, hit hard, and disappeared before rookies could respond. The statistics were humiliating, but they forced adaptation. U.S. Army Situation Report, December 1942. The British, more experienced in desert war, urged caution. They advised Americans to entrench, to build depots, to wait for reinforcements. But Washington pressed for speed, eager to show results. The compromise produced half measures. Attacks launched without preparation, defenses built without depth. Every mistake was punished, yet each punishment was a lesson. A sergeant summarized it. "Every mile east costs us a mile of pride." His bitterness hid truth. The rookies were being forged. The ethical capsule rose in the desert. Geneva covered prisoners, but what of civilians whose fields became battle zones? Tunisian farmers watched olive groves shredded by shells, wells poisoned by gasoline, and homes crushed under tanks. At the time, commanders called it collateral, regrettable but necessary. Historians argue today whether Torch was liberation or intrusion. For locals, the answer was simple. War stole their soil. The ethical dilemma was not abstract. It was visible in every ruined farm. Axis reinforcements grew. By January 1943, more than 100,000 Axis troops stood in Tunisia, with 200 tanks and over 300 aircraft. The Americans now faced not confusion, but discipline. The Wehrmacht intended to teach them a lesson, and soon it would. But the Americans had momentum of their own. They had survived landings, endured French fire, marched across deserts, and tasted German steel. They were still standing. That fact alone mattered. Light played tricks in the coming weeks. At dawn, German columns seemed to vanish into glare. At dusk, American convoys glowed red with brake lights as they crawled over ridges. Pilots described skies that blinded and horizons that deceived. One wrote, "We learned to fear the sun as much as the flak." U.S. Army Air Force Memo, 1943. These sensory details etched themselves into the memory of men who learned war in Africa's light. The statistics of supply grew monstrous. More than 400,000 gallons of fuel burned daily by trucks, tanks, and planes. Over 1.2 million rations consumed each week. Ammunition expenditure averaged 50,000 artillery rounds every 7 days. The logistics officers juggled equations of consumption that dwarfed civilian imagination. One colonel quipped, "We fight with beans as much as bullets." He was right. Torch was as much a contest of arithmetic as of arms. U.S. Army Logistics File, 1943. The rookies hardened. Units that had flinched at first contact began to hold ground. Squads learned to dig before firing, to conceal trucks under nets, to march at night. Engineers bridged wadis with timber. Medics learned to work with dust in every wound. And officers began to trust instinct more than manuals. The Americans were still green, but they were greening fast. The test had become harsher, and so had they. Axis commanders noted the change. Reports in January admitted, "The Americans show stubbornness. They recover losses quickly. Their industry supplies them without pause. They may be clumsy, but they are relentless." Wehrmacht Situation Report, 1943. Relentless was the new word. The rookies had stopped being only learners. They had become a problem. The Axis motif pulsed again. Torch was America's first big test. The beaches had taught survival. The ports had taught improvisation. And now the desert taught endurance. Every lesson was written in blood and numbers. By the end of December, the Americans had not conquered Tunisia, but they had not broken either. In war, the ability to remain standing is often the first victory. The sound defined Tunisia in early 1943. Not the silence of beaches, not the glare of light, but the relentless roar of machines and the constant hammer of guns. Convoys rumbled through valleys with engines echoing against rock. Artillery thunder rolled across ridges day and night. The Luftwaffe descended with a scream that carved fear into every ear. Soldiers no longer needed to see the enemy to know war was near. They only had to listen. The first large clash came near Taburba in December. American armored units pushed forward, hoping to seize ground before Axis reinforcements consolidated. At dawn, the roar of engines filled the air. Shermans and half-tracks grinding forward on dirt tracks still slick from rain. For an hour, it seemed momentum favored the rookies. Then German panzers answered, their 75mm guns cracking with the sound of splitting anvils. The battlefield became a concert of metal on metal, shells slamming into armor, turrets clanging with near hits. A lieutenant recalled, "It was like being inside a furnace that someone kept striking with hammers." U.S. National Archives, 1946. The Germans fought with veteran coordination. They lured Americans into narrow valleys, boxed them with artillery, and let Stukas dive from above. The combined sound was overwhelming. Crashes from above, cracks from the front, the metallic whine of ricochets. By nightfall, dozens of American tanks burned, their explosions popping like drums in the distance. The lesson was brutal but unforgettable. In war, noise itself could paralyze. Logistics strained under the soundscape. Every push east demanded hundreds of truck convoys. Engines coughed, gears ground, and brakes squealed on descents. Drivers wore cotton in ears to endure the monotony of mechanical roar. More than 1,500 vehicles moved daily between Algiers and the Tunisian front by January, each carrying food, fuel, and ammunition. Each mile hummed with risk, for Luftwaffe fighters stalked highways, their guns announcing themselves with rattling bursts that cut engines and set convoys ablaze. U.S. Army Transportation Log, 1943. At Maknassi and Gafsa, Small clashes grew into rolling battles. German artillery spoke first, their shells shrieking across valleys. Then Allied batteries responded, hundreds of guns barking in reply. For hours, men crouched in foxholes with ears ringing, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the cacophony. A corporal wrote, "You could feel the sound in your teeth. It made thoughts scatter." The description captured the sensory violence, sound as a weapon. The Luftwaffe deepened the torment. Ju-87 Stukas dove in screaming pairs, their sirens crafted to terrorize as much as to kill. Ju-88s droned above, dropping sticks of bombs that rolled thunder for minutes after. American gunners fired skyward, their 50 caliber Brownings rattling like giant sewing machines. The duel filled the air with overlapping sound until silence seemed unnatural. More than 120 Allied aircraft were lost in Tunisia by mid-January, many destroyed on the ground by surprise raids. U.S. Army Air Force report, 1943. In villages, civilians suffered their own acoustic nightmare. Bells once used to call prayer now rang as alarms. Streets reverberated with the growl of armored columns. Children learned to distinguish the distant hum of Allied engines from the sharper whine of German vehicles. War made them students of sound. Farmers abandoned olive presses because the noise of machines attracted bombing. Silence, once life, had become impossible. The Americans adapted slowly. They learned to spread convoys, to move at night when noise was masked. Infantry practiced advancing under artillery fire, forcing themselves not to flinch at blasts overhead. Tank crews stuffed cotton and rags into helmets to dull concussions. Gunners learned to count seconds between incoming whistles, estimating distance by pitch. Experience turned noise into data. By January, rookies were no longer paralyzed by sound. They used it. Statistics framed the evolution. Allied forces had deployed more than 250,000 troops across North Africa by early 1943. Axis forces countered with 150,000 Germans and Italians, supported by more than 200 tanks and 400 aircraft. The Americans, though outmatched in skill, were beginning to equalize in volume. For every German shell, the Allies returned 2. For every Luftwaffe sortie, Allied radar tracked a response. The mathematics of war was shifting. U.S. Army Statistical Summary, 1943. The Battle of Kasserine loomed as the culmination. In February 1943, Rommel, still commanding German and Italian troops, prepared to test the Americans directly. He massed over 100 tanks and more than 200 guns against inexperienced divisions guarding passes. The assault began with artillery that shook mountains. For hours, the Kasserine Valley vibrated with explosions, the sound bouncing between ridges like thunder trapped in stone. American lines bent, broke, and scattered under the pressure. Rommel's panzers rolled through gaps, their engines growling like predators unleashed. Infantry followed, shouting orders drowned by the mechanical din. For 2 days, the Americans staggered backward. Trucks burned, tanks smoldered, and radios crackled confusion. One survivor wrote, "It was like being inside a drum. You could not think, only endure." The Germans proved their mastery once again, but the Americans refused to collapse entirely. British units counterattacked, halting the drive. Kasserine was a defeat, but it was not annihilation. The ethical capsule emerged here. Geneva protected prisoners, but what of civilians trapped in valleys under bombardment? Entire villages flattened, homes splintered, families buried. Commanders at the time argued it was unavoidable, a function of terrain and necessity. Historians debate today whether the shelling at Kasserine represented excess or inevitability. Was the valley a military target or a civilian graveyard? The line blurred, and the echoes of those shells still spark argument. By March, the sound of war changed again. Now it was Allied artillery that dominated. More than 500 guns massed in barrages, their overlapping thunder overwhelming German defenses. Engineers repaired roads, allowing convoys to bring thousands of tons of shells forward. American pilots gained confidence, engines roaring above with defiance instead of desperation. The acoustic landscape flipped. Axis soldiers now described Allied barrages as rolling earthquakes. Captured Wehrmacht report, 1943. The Germans noted the shift. Diaries once contemptuous grew wary. A colonel admitted, "The Americans are noisy in every sense. Guns, engines, numbers. Their clumsiness is vanishing. Their industry deafens us." The phrase captured the new reality. The rookies had turned volume into dominance. Every soldier remembered sound differently. For some, it was the whistle of incoming shells. For others, the grinding march of convoys. For others, the constant drone of planes overhead. Together, those memories wrote the sonic diary of Torch's Tunisian campaign. America's first big test was not only written in blood, but in decibels. By April, the numbers confirmed the shift. Allied forces fielded more than 300,000 troops in Tunisia, supplied by convoys that moved 800,000 gallons of fuel and 2 million rations weekly. Axis forces remained fierce but dwindling, their supply lines strained across the Mediterranean. The louder voice now belonged to the Allies, their artillery, engines, and aircraft filling valleys with relentless sound. The test was not complete, but its outcome was now audible. America had learned to roar. By the spring of 1943, Tunisia smelled of war before it sounded or looked like war. Convoys left a trail of gasoline fumes that clung to roads for hours. Camps reeked of sweat, damp wool, and burned coffee brewed in tin cups. The battlefield had its own odors: cordite from shells, smoke from burning trucks, the acrid stench of scorched rubber. In villages, the smells mixed: spices from markets, bread baking in clay ovens, manure from stables, and over it all, the unmistakable tang of destruction. For Americans, new to Africa, the nose carried as many lessons as the eyes or ears. The campaign had entered a grinding phase. After the shock of Kasserine, the Americans regrouped under new commanders. General Eisenhower reorganized supply lines while General Patton took charge of 2 corps. Discipline hardened and so did planning. When convoys moved now, they moved with escorts. When attacks were launched, they began with barrages, not blind rushes. The mathematics of war had been learned. Every attack required tons of shells. Every mile required barrels of fuel. By March, more than 900,000 gallons of gasoline were flowing weekly from ports to front. U.S. Army Quartermaster Report, 1943. The villages closest to the front endured smells that blended old life with new violence. Markets that once sold olives and figs now lay beside depots where kerosene seeped into soil. Farmers who had crushed grapes for wine now smelled diesel from trucks parked in vineyards. One Tunisian farmer recalled years later, "The earth smelled strange, half food, half fire." BBC interview, 1962. The war invaded nostrils before it stole fields. American camps became factories of survival. Kitchens produced thousands of rations daily, the scent of beans and canned meat filling valleys. Latrines added their own contribution, carried by wind into foxholes. Soldiers joked grimly that they could find their way to the front by smell alone. When artillery barrages opened, the smoke rolled over them with a bitter perfume, drifting miles beyond the guns. The rookies learned that every smell was a warning. Fuel meant tanks, manure meant cavalry animals, burning oil meant wreckage ahead. Tunisia's climate made odors linger. Heat baked waste into dust, spreading it through camps. Rain soaked trenches, releasing a swampy rot from food scraps and corpses alike. The dead had their own signature. Soldiers remembered how fallen men changed the air, turning stomachs before eyes found bodies. Medics wrote of working under a haze of ether, iodine, and blood. For them, war was not only a sight of wounds, but the stench of trying to close them. U.S. Medical Corps Report, 1943. Amid this, cultural collisions deepened. American soldiers brought chocolate, gum, and cigarettes to barter with villagers. The sweet smell of Hershey bars and Lucky Strikes contrasted with the pungent spices of souks. Children followed patrols, drawn by the aroma of coffee brewing in army camps. To many locals, Americans seemed like walking markets, yet mistrust lingered. Some villages smelled gunpowder at night, knowing Axis patrols passed nearby. War turned every cent into a signal. German forces fought fiercely for every hill and ridge. Their own camps reeked of horse sweat, for they relied heavily on animal transport. Their vehicles leaked oil that soaked into sandy soil. Prisoners captured by Americans often carried the sour odor of unwashed uniforms, a contrast to GIs supplied with soap and water by abundant logistics. One prisoner admitted, "We smelled them before we saw them: soap, tobacco, coffee. We knew their supply was endless." U.S. National Archives, 1946. That contrast was not cosmetic. It symbolized industrial might. The Americans began launching larger offensives. At El Guetar in March, Patton's forces attacked with artillery that rumbled for hours. Each shell added smoke, drifting across hills with the sharp bite of explosives. Soldiers marched forward through fog that tasted bitter on tongues, carried in airways until it burned. The Germans counterattacked with tanks, their exhaust filling valleys with choking diesel. For men crouched in foxholes, the smells were clues: friendly or enemy, advance or retreat. The battlefield was an olfactory map. Statistics tell the grind. By April, Allied forces in Tunisia numbered over 300,000, consuming more than 3 million rations weekly. Ammunition expenditure topped 250,000 artillery shells per month. Axis forces, reduced to 150,000 men, relied on dwindling supplies ferried across the Mediterranean. Their convoys smelled of desperation, fish, fuel, and fear. Allied air patrols hunted them relentlessly, leaving oil slicks and burning ships that stained coasts with the smell of ash. Allied Naval Summary, 1943. The ethical capsule emerged in ruined farms. Geneva spoke of prisoners, but who spoke for villagers whose groves burned or whose wells filled with gasoline? Commanders called it necessity. Historians today debate whether North African civilians bore the heaviest price of torch. To them, liberation came wrapped in smoke and ruin. Was it freedom if orchards no longer bore fruit? The debate lingers, as persistent as the odors of war that lasted long after guns fell silent. American soldiers adjusted their senses. They learned to associate the sweet tang of gasoline with air support, for it meant planes overhead. They came to respect the earthy smell of mule lines, for it meant supplies reached front. They feared the sudden drift of garlic and tobacco in wind, for it often signaled German patrols nearby. Training manuals had not prepared them for this. War itself wrote new codes, and noses became scouts. Civilians adapted too. Tunisian women baked bread for troops, its aroma offering fleeting comfort. Children carried baskets of oranges, the citrus cutting through the bitterness of smoke. These simple smells reminded soldiers of home, even as shells whistled overhead. Letters home described not just battles, but scents. Coffee brewed on campfires, bread from villages, the unforgettable stench of burned tanks. Smell became memory, perhaps more lasting than sound or sight. The campaign's intensity grew. In late March and April, the Americans and British pressed the Axis into shrinking pockets. Battles at Fondouk and Medjez el Bab filled valleys with overlapping odors. Fuel, fire, rot, and spring blossoms crushed under boots. The mixture was surreal, beauty and horror sharing air. A British observer wrote, "Tunisia smells of roses and death." Imperial War Museum Memoir, 1947. The paradox captured the essence of war's contradictions. By May, the campaign neared its end. More than 230,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, the largest capitulation since Stalingrad. Prisoners marched past Allied camps, their uniforms ragged, their bodies reeking of exhaustion. The Americans who guarded them carried the smell of abundance: soap, fresh rations, gasoline. One German officer muttered, "We lost not to men, but to factories." His words, though bitter, echoed truth. America's first great test had proved not just courage, but capacity. The numbers sealed the story. Torch cost the Allies more than 70,000 casualties, but secured North Africa as a launching point for Europe. It consumed millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of ships, and endless labor. It taught the United States to fight coalition war, to move mountains of material, and to endure. The rookies had grown into veterans, their memory forever tied to the smells of Tunisia. As the last Axis troops marched into captivity, Americans looked east toward Sicily. The air still smelled of gasoline and cordite, but also of victory. Operation Torch had begun with confusion and doubt. It ended with confidence earned through endurance. The test was passed and the world had taken notice. America was ready for the next trial. North Africa glowed with strange light in early 1943. Desert sun by day blinded soldiers, reflecting off sand like sheets of fire. At night, artillery lit valleys with jagged flashes, each explosion casting shadows that danced and vanished in seconds. Convoys moved under headlights covered by slits, narrow beams cutting tunnels through darkness. To fight here was to live in a world constantly illuminated or obscured. Sight itself turned into a weapon. The alliance struggled under that glare. Americans and British shared victories, but not always trust. British commanders carried years of experience from desert campaigns, and they treated their American counterparts as inexperienced juniors. Americans, eager to prove themselves, bristled at every correction. Meetings stretched long into the night under lantern light, maps spread across tables, tempers sparking like flares. One officer recalled, "The room was brighter from arguments than from lamps." U.S. National Archives, 1946. French politics complicated everything. Torch had begun with uncertainty. Would Vichy forces resist or yield? They had resisted in some ports, surrendered in others. Now Charles de Gaulle pressed for recognition of Free France, while Admiral Darlan, once Vichy's man, had switched allegiance before being assassinated. The Americans found themselves not only fighting Germans, but navigating a maze of loyalties. Every discussion seemed lit by conflicting lanterns. Shadows never aligned. Diplomacy shaped the battlefield as much as guns. Eisenhower struggled to balance British demands, French sensitivities, and Roosevelt's directives. Decisions made under lamps in Algiers rippled to front lines where soldiers paid in blood. When reinforcements hesitated due to political wrangling, German troops seized positions by daylight. Every delay cost ground. Historians argue today that Torch was as much a test of politics as of steel. On the battlefield, mistakes shone bright. At Sidi Bouzid, American units advanced too far without reconnaissance. At dawn, the desert shimmered calm, then erupted as German panzers emerged from rising sun. Their armor gleamed silver before firing, shells flashing in sudden arcs. The ambush destroyed dozens of tanks, leaving smoldering wrecks glowing orange against sand. Survivors remembered the blinding effect. The sun was behind them. We never saw them until fire was upon us. U.S. Army After Action Report, 1943. Kasserines' lessons had not yet fully sunk in. Radio discipline faltered. Units marched in broad daylight without camouflage, exposing themselves to air attack. German aircraft pounced, their bombs igniting convoys in brilliant chains. Explosions rolled across valleys like strobe lights, burning images into eyes. Soldiers stumbled half-blinded, vision seared by fire. Torch was a teacher that illuminated errors in merciless clarity. Yet light also offered hope. Allied artillery at night painted skies with arcs of tracers, red and green streaks that seemed almost beautiful. Searchlights probed heavens for enemy bombers, their beams converging like white fingers. Villagers watched from hillsides, describing skies as bright as festivals. But beneath those lights came destruction. Bombs falling into towns, fires spreading. For civilians, war was both spectacle and nightmare. Allied commanders adjusted. Eisenhower instituted stricter coordination, while Patton drilled troops on camouflage, movement at night, and discipline under fire. Engineers built new airstrips lit with carefully shielded lamps, guiding reinforcements safely in. Convoys shifted to dusk and dawn, hiding in shadows instead of blazing under sun. Slowly, the Americans learned to fight with light, not against it. Statistics measured their growth. By April, more than 1,500 aircraft flew under Allied command in North Africa, up from fewer than 600 in November. Supply deliveries doubled, reaching over 120,000 tons per month. Axis aircraft, fewer than 300 by spring, could no longer dominate skies. The balance of light shifted. Where once German flares revealed American weakness, now Allied searchlights tracked Axis bombers with precision. Allied Air Command Summary, 1943. Diplomatic struggles persisted. De Gaulle pressed harder, his Free French demanding recognition over Giraud's leadership. Americans hesitated, fearing splits among allies. Churchill backed compromise, but tensions flared. One British officer wrote, "Our greatest enemy here is not Rommel, but pride. Ours and theirs." Imperial War Museum Memoir, 1947. The metaphor fit the scene. Too much light exposed fractures even within an alliance. In villages, light carried danger. Civilians covered windows at night to avoid attracting bombers. Candles burned low, meals taken in near darkness. Children grew up fearing lamps, associating brightness with death from above. For them, shadows meant safety. War inverted nature. Darkness protected, light betrayed. The lesson scarred memory long after guns fell silent. The ethical capsule sharpened in air raids. Geneva protected prisoners but said little about bombing cities by night. Was it strategy or terror when flares lit neighborhoods before bombs fell? Commanders called it necessity, claiming German troops hid among civilians. Historians debate whether Allied raids in North Africa blurred morality. To light a city and strike was effective, but was it just? The argument endures like embers that never fade. By late April, torch was proving itself more than survival. American units advanced with confidence, coordinating with British armor and artillery. Night battles, once chaotic, now unfolded with rhythm. Searchlights swept skies. Anti-aircraft guns roared in synchronization, and flares marked targets with eerie precision. For the first time, German commanders admitted Americans had grown. One diary read, "They march under sun, they fire under stars, they have become soldiers." Captured Wehrmacht Report, 1943. Still, the test was costly. Allied casualties in Tunisia exceeded 70,000 by campaign's end. German and Italian losses reached 250,000 prisoners. Each number represented lives consumed under light and fire. For Americans, the first great test was baptism not only in blood, but in illumination. The world now saw them clearly. Torch ended with surrender in May, but its glow lingered. It had lit paths to Sicily, to Italy, and eventually to Normandy. It had illuminated flaws, discipline, and strength. For the Americans, once shadowed by inexperience, the campaign proved they could endure glare. The rookie army stepped from darkness into light, no longer untested, no longer uncertain. The end of the Tunisian campaign was felt not only in maps and communiques, but in bodies and skin. Heat pressed on every soldier like a weight. The desert floor radiated through boots, blistering soles until each step burned. Dust clung to skin in layers, turning sweat into mud. Men rubbed hands on uniforms only to grind grit deeper into pores. War in North Africa was not abstract strategy, but the sensation of exhaustion etched into flesh. By May 1943, Axis forces had collapsed. More than 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered, a number larger than the entire garrison of Stalingrad. Fields once lined with olive groves now held endless rows of prisoners, their rough wool uniforms heavy with dust. The Americans touched victory for the first time in Europe, and it was tangible. Rifles warm in hands, enemy helmets collected, documents seized from trembling fingers. One GI wrote, "We could feel the end of their strength in our grip." U.S. National Archives, 1946. For the Americans, the lessons of touch were as vital as numbers. They had learned the weight of a full pack carried across 30 miles of desert. They had learned the texture of sandbags, rough against raw palms. They had learned how mud sucked boots during rains, clinging until every stride demanded willpower. These were not abstractions. They were the tactile dictionary of war. Every callus on a hand was a new entry. The victories of April and May were not clean. At Mejez el Bab, soldiers crawled forward on rough stone, knees torn open by rock. The ground itself seemed hostile. Tanks crushed ridges but left behind sharp fragments that cut hands during climbs. In foxholes, men dug until shovels struck stone, then finished with bleeding fingers. One corporal remembered, "The earth gave us nothing easily. Even dirt fought us." U.S. Army Infantry Report, 1943. Exhaustion permeated every action. Soldiers fell asleep sitting, rifles still in arms, backs pressed to stone walls. The weight of helmets carved grooves into foreheads. The pressure of webbing straps dug into shoulders until skin bruised. They carried artillery shells, each weighing over 90 pounds, across slopes where every slip tore skin. The Americans discovered that victory was measured not just in maps captured, but in muscles destroyed. The statistics revealed the scale. By the end of the Tunisian campaign, American forces had consumed more than 3 million rations weekly, hauled 800,000 gallons of fuel each month, and fired over 500,000 artillery shells. Axis forces, starved of supplies, surrendered entire divisions intact. The touch of abundance had defeated the feel of scarcity. Soldiers remarked that Germans looked hollow, their grips weak, their boots worn thin. The Americans felt strong by comparison, not only in spirit, but in body. U.S. Army Statistical Review, 1943. Prisoners themselves noticed. One captured German officer confessed, "We felt the weight of their industry on our shoulders. Every shell, every ration, every vehicle pressed us down." Captured Wehrmacht Report, 1943. His words captured more than metaphor. For men who had marched across Europe, North Africa was the first time they physically felt outmatched. They were pressed into surrender by the industrial weight of America. The ethical capsule emerged in treatment of prisoners. Geneva spoke of standards, but how were hundreds of thousands to be fed and housed in barren land? The Americans improvised, feeding Axis troops with the same rations their own men carried. Guards recalled the strangeness of handing food to those they had fought days earlier. Some called it humanity, others a logistical necessity. Historians today ask, was generosity strategic, aimed at showing moral superiority, or was it simply efficiency? The line remains blurred, like sweat streaks on dusty faces. Tunisia's civilians felt the aftermath in touch as well. Walls scarred by shrapnel became daily reminders. Farmers found fields hardened by shell fire, soil compacted into stone. Children touched tank wrecks rusting in sun, their metal still hot years later. The war left scars not only in memory, but in textures embedded into landscapes. Villagers rebuilt with hands calloused by clearing rubble, bricks rougher than before, stones piled anew. For the Americans, the campaign marked the transformation from amateurs to professionals. They had learned how to grip rifles through endless marches, how to brace shovels in unyielding ground, how to steady artillery pieces that bucked like beasts. They had learned how to bear weight, literally and figuratively. Victory in Tunisia was not only strategic, but tactile. It was felt in bones, in backs, in the rawness of skin. Letters home described not just sights, but sensations. A sergeant wrote, "Your hands would know this war better than your eyes. Rope burns from pulling trucks, calluses from digging, burns from hot gun barrels. Even the paper I write on feels rougher now." Letter, April 1943, U.S. National Archives. Families who read such words understood that war changed a man's touch before it changed his thoughts. Cultural encounters carried tactile memory too. Americans shook hands with Tunisian farmers who brought oranges. The roughness of local palms told stories of labor, resilience, and survival. Prisoners felt the firm grip of American guards. Soldiers stroked the manes of horses abandoned by German units, discovering animals lean but still warm. War's diplomacy was often physical, communicated by touch when words failed. As Axis resistance collapsed, The tactile contrast sharpened. German equipment felt crude and worn compared to American supplies. Captured boots had thin soles, while GI boots remained sturdy. Captured rifles felt heavier, rougher in design. Prisoners often asked to hold American gear, marveling at smooth finishes and reliable mechanisms. Industry left fingerprints on everything. The Americans carried scars as well. Fingers lost sensation from frost in winter passes. Shoulders bore permanent indentations from straps. Men spoke of phantom weight after the campaign, as if their bodies still carried packs long after they were removed. War imprinted itself physically, leaving grooves deeper than medals or maps could show. When Tunisia finally fell in May, the sensation of release was almost shocking. Soldiers dropped packs, feeling spines straighten. They washed dust from hands, feeling skin again. They lay on blankets without boots, the softness almost alien. One lieutenant wrote, "The strangest feeling of all was to feel nothing, to lie still, without stone, without straps, without fire." U.S. Army Letter Archive, 1943. That moment, more than the surrender parade, defined victory for men on the ground. Torch's legacy was more than strategy. It taught the United States Army how to feel war. The weight of logistics, the grind of exhaustion, the physical cost of endurance, these lessons embedded themselves into doctrine. Later campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy carried echoes of Tunisia's calluses. America had learned to fight not only with steel and numbers, but with bodies hardened for the strain. The numbers concluded the tale. Torch had deployed more than 300,000 American troops, consumed millions of rations, captured 250,000 prisoners, and cost over 70,000 Allied casualties. Behind each figure was a tactile truth. Hands rubbed raw, shoulders bent under weight, feet blistered on rock. America emerged from Torch scarred but stronger, carrying the imprint of its first great trial overseas. The rookie nation had touched war, and in doing so had touched destiny. Victory in North Africa did not taste sweet at first. For most soldiers, the flavor of Torch was dust in their mouths, the grit that stuck to teeth after a day's march. Meals were often cold rations swallowed with the bitterness of fatigue. Coffee brewed in helmets tasted of metal and smoke. Bread brought from Tunisian villages carried hints of spice and clay, unfamiliar yet comforting. In letters home, soldiers described war not only in sights or sounds, but in flavors. "Every bite of food here tastes of sand," one private wrote. U.S. National Archives, 1943. Rations defined daily life. Each American carried K-rations, biscuits, processed cheese, canned meat, a tablet of chocolate. The cheese clung to the tongue with a salty tang, while the chocolate melted into syrup in desert heat. Soldiers joked that gum included in packets was the sweetest thing in North Africa. Germans who surrendered envied these flavors. Many Axis prisoners remarked not on weapons but on food. "Your men eat better than our officers," one admitted. Captured Wehrmacht Report, 1943. Abundance had a taste, and it was unmistakably American. The water carried memory too. Wells near camps often tasted of chlorine, treated to prevent disease. Soldiers compared it to drinking swimming pools. Canteens filled from rivers carried mud and algae, turning water into earthy soup. On rare occasions, troops drank fresh citrus juice pressed by locals, the sour-sweet shock exploding on tongues after weeks of stale liquid. Such tastes were unforgettable. Veterans later recalled the lemonade of Tunisia more vividly than battles. Battle itself had its flavors. Men in trenches licked lips and found dust mixed with cordite, the bitter taste of exploded shells coating throats. Blood carried iron tang, sometimes swallowed after biting lips in fear. Medics working over wounds spoke of metallic taste in air, iron mingling with disinfectant. Smoke from oil fires drifted into mouths, acrid and greasy. To taste war was to know it had invaded not only land, but body. Exhaustion shaped flavor. Meals were gulped without savor, eaten quickly before orders resumed. Soldiers swallowed half-chewed biscuits, washed down by lukewarm water, the aftertaste lingering as they marched. Hunger sharpened perception. Even bland beans seemed rich when eaten after 12 hours of digging. Yet nothing erased the taste of dust, carried on wind into every bite. A soldier joked, "We don't eat food, we eat Africa." U.S. Army Field Journal, 1943. Cultural encounters carried taste as diplomacy. Americans traded canned meat for olives, raisins, and bread. Tunisian dishes, stews heavy with cumin, lamb roasted over coals, introduced flavors unknown to GIs from Kansas or Ohio. Some embraced the novelty, others rejected it, longing for simple American fare. But all remembered the meals. One recalled, "The war tasted like spices we could not name, mixed with dust we could not escape." BBC Oral History, 1960. Food became memory as much as combat. Victory also had symbolic flavors. When Tunis fell, soldiers looted German supplies. They found wine, sausages, and hard bread. Drinking captured bottles, they toasted survival. Yet even these feasts carried bitterness. Some choked down alcohol with grim faces, aware of the dead who could not share it. The taste of triumph was mixed with grief. Torch had been a test, and the taste of its passing was complex. The ethical capsule emerges in rationing. Geneva required feeding prisoners, and Americans gave Axis captives the same rations as their own troops. To Germans, used to scarcity, the flavors were shock. Sweet chocolate, rich meat, even powdered milk astonished them. Commanders explained it as regulation, but historians debate. Was it humanity or propaganda? Did the flavor of abundance serve as moral weapon? The question lingers, like the aftertaste of bitter coffee. Numbers give scale. By campaign's end, Americans had delivered over 45 million individual rations to front lines. More than 900,000 gallons of water were purified monthly. German prisoners consumed millions of American meals in captivity. Logistics turned flavor into strategy. The tongue became proof of power. To feed an army was to win a war. Quartermaster General Report, 1943. Civilians tasted war differently. For them, food grew scarce. Markets emptied as armies bought or seized supplies. Families relied on American handouts, cans of Spam, flour sacks, powdered milk. Children grew up tasting chocolate for the first time, gifts from GIs. Many later described that sweetness as the moment they associated America with hope. War left them hungry, but the taste of survival carried foreign notes: sugar, cocoa, tinned meat. The Americans carried those memories home. Veterans decades later recalled not only battles, but flavors. The coffee brewed over campfires, acrid yet warming. The gum chewed endlessly to fight thirst. The cigarettes shared after meals, smoke mixing with beans. For them, war had a palate: bitter dust, salty sweat, metallic fear, occasional sweetness. Memory returned to the tongue even when words failed. Torch shaped America's role beyond Africa. The lessons of logistics, coalition politics, and combat carried into Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. But soldiers remembered Tunisia most by what it felt and tasted like. War was not abstract strategy, but sand in food, chlorine in water, blood in air. To endure was to swallow these things and continue. That was the true test. Historians note that America's rise as global power began here, in the ability to feed armies, to supply abundance, to make war taste of plenty. The Axis could not match it. Factories in Detroit and Chicago produced not only tanks, but chocolate bars. Ships carried not only shells, but flour. To win wars, nations had to fill mouths as well as arsenals. Torch proved America could do both. The final numbers cement legacy. More than 300,000 American troops participated, 250,000 Axis prisoners captured, 70,000 Allied casualties sustained. Millions of meals eaten, millions of gallons of water consumed, millions of tons of supplies delivered. Behind each number was a flavor: dust, metal, salt, sweetness. The war imprinted itself on tongues as much as on maps. Torch ended, but its taste lingered. For soldiers, the flavor of victory was not champagne or parades. It was bread baked by Tunisian families, chocolate bars melting in heat, coffee brewed black and bitter, water that never tasted clean. It was survival flavored by endurance. America's first big test in World War II was swallowed bite by bite, sip by sip, until the test was passed.